In the next panel, we want to take an opportunity to look at energy efficiency within the context of COVID-19, which has disproportionately impacted low and moderate income households. Just a reminder, if you're going to be asking questions, go up to the right side of your screen. There's the question tab, and to put your questions there and not in chat. So Doug, why don't you introduce our moderator and a little bit about the program as well.
Great. Well, at the very end of the last segment, you heard a mention of women in renewable energy, and Caroline Carl, our moderator, also very involved in that group. She's also a member of the program committee for the Energy Conference, and our topic, as Frank mentioned, is efficiency. And there's kind of a tension sometimes. We are kind of talking about these things up at the policy level, but especially over the last year and a half, there's a reality here of people who simply weren't able to pay their electric bill. And so this panel is very important, and efficiency is particularly important because, again, we have been dealing with situations lately where people literally just cannot afford the electric bill. And so some of these other things we've been talking about are bigger picture, they're more of a corporate level investment, but these really are the programs that hopefully can help people in their homes. So it's a very important topic, and we're very pleased to bring you this panel. It's got some good participation from across the country. And with no further ado, let's turn it over to Caroline.
Well, aloha everyone, and welcome. What an honor it is to be here. It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you to Doug and Frank for teeing this up. And really, I don't think Dawn and Leslie could have done a better job on the introduction on the importance of women in this space. But as Doug mentioned, I'm Caroline Carl, and I'm the Deputy Director of Hawaii Energy. For those of you who are not familiar with Hawaii Energy, we're the ratepayer-funded energy efficiency program administrator, and for Hawaii, Honolulu, and Maui counties. Our mission is to empower island families and businesses to make smart energy choices, to reduce consumption, save money, and pursue a 100% clean energy future. One of the core tenets of our work, and what we're going to talk a bit more about today, is an increased focus on accessibility and affordability for clean energy technologies so that everyone can move forward together. Over the past 12 years, Hawaii Energy programs have provided over $2 billion in electric bill savings, bringing immediate relief to those families and communities who need it the most, especially over the last year. I am incredibly honored to be sharing the virtual stage with these three amazing women whose work really embodies the critical responsibilities we have to reduce energy insecurity and improve well-being as we move towards our clean energy future. I know that this has been poignantly discussed by many before us in this panel, so I will just make some introductions and get things kicked off. First, Ariel Drehobl. Welcome, Ariel. Ariel is the manager on ACEEE's local policy team, where she leads work related to energy equity, energy affordability, and low-income energy efficiency program. She also provides direct policy and research assistance to utilities, local governments, community-based organizations, and others working to advance affordability policies and programs. A fun fact that we learned this week about Ariel is that she has actually been updating her own photo blog every day for the past 11 years, which is incredible dedication. Next, we have Rebecca Foster. Rebecca is VEIC's CEO, and she guides the organization's strategic planning, corporate goal setting, business development, and performance. With more than 2 decades of experience in clean energy industry and 10 years at VEIC, Rebecca has focused on fostering collaboration and engaging tough challenges head-on. Her vision is for VEIC to become a leader in decarbonization while centering equity and accessibility. A fun fact that we have learned about Rebecca is that when she was 25, she actually ran the Kona Half Marathon with her mom while her mom walked the course. But we still can't get her to tell us how long ago 25 was. So, and finally, Lala Ness, from the Moku of Ewa, Oahu, and Hilo on the island of Hawaii. She is a UH Manoa alumni and an East-West Center Fellow. And she has been with the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency as the Climate Resilience and Equity Manager for the last 2 years. Her background is diverse and includes the corporate travel industry and sustainability, place-based community organizing and advocacy, and creative arts and INA-based development initiatives that center in sociocultural and ecological justice and well-being. And the really fun fact that we learned about Lala was that her babysitters while she was growing up were horses, which is so cool. I need some of those for my kids. So welcome again, and thank you all for joining. Just a reminder, as Frank mentioned, and many have prior to me, please use the Q&A tab for questions. We have allowed some time at the end of this panel to answer your questions, and we really are excited to engage. So Lala, I'd like to kick it off with you. As just a few weeks ago, the Honolulu City Council voted to adopt the Climate Action Plan, which is awesome. It establishes 9 strategies and 47 actions, many relating to energy efficiency and renewable energy. But I was hoping what we could talk about first is you could share a bit more about your work in establishing equity-centered practices and processes as it relates to these climate resiliency efforts.
Aloha, mahalo, Carolyn, and aloha, everyone. Rebecca, Ariel. Mahalo for having me today. I'm outside, so don't mind the noise if there is any, and let me know if you can't hear. Yeah, basically, for the last 2 years, the equity program has been facilitating access, agency, and advocacy to increase climate change frontline communities' participation and representation in programs, projects, and policies throughout the city's climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives. And in Hawaii, these communities are mostly made up of Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, considering age, gender, and place of residency as well. In a quick overview, because equity is the breadth and depth of it could take up the whole 2-day conference if we really wanted to, but kind of 3 points to really focus in on is normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing equity within our work. Starting off with normalizing, really laying a foundation around equity through incorporating training and professional development, using explicit language, really grounded in text and context and relationality. And in Hawaii, Indigenous voices need to play a central role for normalizing conversations about socioeconomic and environmental justice. The equity program just completed facilitating the inaugural citywide Equity Foundations training workshop series last week. Yeah. 42 city employees from Department of Permitting Planning to Board of Water, and I think 11 other participated in that. From the organized space, really looking at tools, metrics, data, benchmarking, programs, projects, and policies, really need to establish clear, equity-centered processes and goals that are demonstrating through organizing around structural, procedural, distributional, transgenerational, and cultural equity. You know, with the recent creation of the Equitable Community Engagement Guide is another example, and the adoption of the city's first ever climate action plan, as you mentioned. Equity is planned to be better centered within the next 3 to 5 years of the first phase of implementation. We're really working with city agencies to build capacity and centering equity through utilizing data like energy burden, metrics like community-led goals, utilizing data, I mentioned as well, and the benchmarking aspect of the data, which it also includes socioeconomic and other framings, and community engaged practices, really looking at standardizing engagement protocols and guidelines. And the last one I'll just mention quickly is the operationalizing phase. So this should really consist of ongoing implementation, observation, tracking, iteration, and resourcing. Equity is not a checklist, and it's not a one and done. It's an ongoing, evolving competency and investment that allows for agility, inclusivity, and really economic effectiveness appropriate to place and people. Operationalizing equity within the energy sector is going to require the demonstration of marginalized community members' ability and agency to participate in decision-making and directly benefiting from the market. The city's Office of Economic Revitalization is working with the Resilience Office's equity program in creating an equity rubric for their Climate Solutions Fund RFP, hopefully, crossing our fingers, which is influenced by the Ainaloha Economic Futures Policy and Action Agenda. You know, Don mentioned it so beautifully earlier during your interview that engagement and social investment need to be the same as how much we're investing in our technological side of things. And another national model is the Nexus, which has been created by USDN, which is a literal playbook on equity recovery and climate resiliency processes. So that was a lot. I'll stop there. Mahalo.
Thanks so much, Lala. And it is a lot, and I think we're going to dig in a bit more. But I'd love to kick it over to you, Ariel, because I know ACEEE is working extensively at the utility, city, and state levels in its commitment to advancing equitable clean energy. Can you share some more about ACEEE's Leading with Equity initiative and your research?
Sure, most certainly. So I'll start by saying, oh, thank you, moving the slide forward. I'll start by saying that ACEEE, we are a nonprofit research-based organization that's committed to advancing policies that move us towards a more equitable energy system. And as you can see on this slide here, it might be a little small for some, but this is showing This is showing how ACEEE is thinking about equity now. And I'd say similar to what Lala said, ACEEE also thinks about equity along procedural, distributional, structural, and transgenerational lines. And we really need a system that institutionalizes accountability, that embeds inclusive, accessible, and authentic engagement, recognizes and addresses inequitable structures, ensures representation, power, and influence from community members, considers intergenerational impacts, and achieves a fair distribution of benefits and burdens across communities. And for nearly 15 years, ACEEE has released scorecards and progress reports with the aim of benchmarking and driving clean energy actions along state, city, and utility lines. And for these, we collect data on hundreds of metrics, which we make available to the public in our online databases. And this year, we launched our Leading with Equity initiative, which is going to guide our inclusion of additional equity-focused metrics into and across all of our scorecards. And through the initiative this year, we're working to convene 2 concurrent parallel advisory groups, one consisting of community-based organizations and advocates, and another of utilities and program administrators, to help us generate proposed metrics and changes to the scorecards moving forward, with the goal of ensuring that the metrics in our scorecards reflect the interests of marginalized communities and represent this system that we're looking to move towards. We also want to ensure that all of those who are leaders in our scorecards are leading on equity in order to be scored at the top. So we'll be publishing results of this initiative at the end of the year, and then working to collect data and score on these more equity-focused metrics in our scorecards next year.
Thank you, Ariel. I mean, we hang on those scorecards as so much part of our planning and implementation. And Rebecca, it's so great to have you back on the conference stage. You know, Hawaii Energy has been working closely with your team on a number of programs focused on accessibility and affordability. So I was hoping you could just kick us off with some background on VEIC's policy, philosophies and strategies for addressing climate emergency for all customers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Caroline. It's great to be here with everyone. I wanted to start off my remarks, as Carolyn noted, with the why. You know, why is VEIC? Why should all of us be so focused on equity and burden issues today? And, you know, I'll share that over VEIC's 35-year history, we've had a long standing and strong commitment to bringing the benefits of clean energy to low-income people and communities. That's why we're a nonprofit organization. And over the years, that commitment has expanded from low-income customers and communities to really looking at energy justice in a stronger way, trying to support communities that have borne the brunt and the negative impacts of our society's historical energy choices. So the commitment that we are kind of bringing to our work on these issues of equity is driven not only by that philosophy, which is longstanding, but also by what I would call a very pragmatic and grounded analysis of what it's going to take to address the climate emergency that we face. So, just for a moment, I want to reflect on that a little bit and say that, with the time that we have left on climate, our perspective is that we need to enlist everyone in the clean energy transition and ensure that everyone can access and then realize the benefits that clean energy brings. And I think about last month, the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 pathway, it backs up that approach and that necessity. Just thinking about the work that they spell out that needs to happen in the next 8.5 years by 2030, just to get on the pathway to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. We need to decrease appliance energy use by 25% compared to last year. We need to retrofit 20% of existing buildings to be zero carbon ready, up from 1% now. We need to build all new buildings to zero carbon ready standards. We need to have 600 million heat pumps operating compared to 180 million now. We need to avoid 12% of residential energy demand through behavior changes. We need to have 100% of lighting sales worldwide be LED. We need to ensure that 60% of new car sales are electric, up from 5% worldwide now, and have 400 million private EV chargers in place. And those are just the first steps in what needs to be a decades-long effort to transition to a cleaner, more equitable, and more just energy system. And as I think about the magnitude of that work and the amount of work in front of us, I simply cannot envision a pathway to doing that work in the time we have without dramatically rethinking our energy policies, our clean energy program design, and our implementation, how those programs actually reach communities. We need to ensure that all of that work reaches the people who have not been able to participate in clean energy to date. So what I'm, excited about with this, conversation today is really to enlist all of you at the conference in that difficult but absolutely necessary work as we think about shifting our energy system forward and bringing these benefits that we know exist and we know are so crucial from clean energy programs and projects to the people who really need them. And that's something I can talk about a little bit more as we get into the topic of energy burden.
Yeah, I know we've had, we have so much to talk about and it's always challenging, but I did want to just call out, I would be remiss as a moderator if I did not highlight that just last week, Ariel's work and Efficiency Vermont were highlighted by Catherine Hamilton on our beloved Energy Gang podcast. So, Rebecca, VEIC and Vermont's work is phenomenal. So if you haven't had a chance to listen, please do so. So I know we're already feeling short on time, so I want to shift gears a bit and talk about energy burden because it is referenced quite a bit and it's becoming an important guidepost for efficiency programs and cities. So Ariel, can you ACEEE just updated your report. Can you share more about the key findings and what was measured?
Sure, I'd love to. If you could bring up the third slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So ACEEE, we published our most recent energy burden report in September of 2020. And this slide here is from VEIC, actually, and it's showing the definition of energy burden, which is total household spending on energy bills divided by total household income. And researchers often refer to 6% as a high energy burden threshold, where the average is typically 3% nationally. And if you go to the next slide, this slide has some of the high-level findings from the energy burden study that we published recently. So just to hit on a few of the key takeaways, we found that when we looked at energy burdens nationally across the country, that Black, Hispanic, Native American, older adult households, and renters all experience disproportionately high energy burdens, which means that they're paying more of their income on energy bills than similar households. And this is showing some of the inherent inequity within our system today. We also found that these disproportionately high burdens were a universal issue. We saw them nationally, regionally, and across all 25 metro areas that we looked at in our study, which means that there's work that can be done across the federal government, across local governments, state governments, and with utilities to work to address these disparities. And I'll just quickly say too that I'll say energy burden, it's a great metric to measure equity in the energy sector, but it's not the only metric that can measure energy insecurity, and it only tells part of the story. So when evaluating programs for equity, it's important to think about a whole list of factors, which we can talk more about as well in this panel in order to measure that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rebecca, Efficiency Vermont has done some extensive work in mapping energy burden. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how it influenced program design?
Yes, definitely. And the next slide actually provides a great example of this. So this is a map that the EIC put together in Vermont, which is where we're headquartered and where we operate Efficiency Vermont. And as we approach the topic of making our programs more accessible and equitable, we really wanted to understand what's the landscape we're looking at. Vermont has 251 small towns, and we have some program data about where participation has been greatest over the years, but we encountered some open questions as we looked at our program design and decided in 2019 to really make a significant shift and look carefully at how energy burden was mapping across our entire community landscape. So what you see here is the darker orange towns are those that have the highest burden. The dark blue towns are those that have the lowest burden. And you can see the characteristics across the state. We have a large part of the state in the Northwest that has a lot of economic opportunities, a lot of jobs, higher incomes in those households, and then lots of places throughout the state where energy burden is quite high. And thinking about the point that Ariel just made about, an average national energy burden being about 3%, high energy burden being 6%, the numbers here show that we've got significant challenges facing households in Vermont. And when we look at this in other states as well, we see similar patterns. The highest burden communities you see here are like the average is 17.5% in those communities. We have some communities that are approaching 20%. So imagine using 20% of your income to pay for your energy costs. And this includes transportation, importantly. That's a significant challenge. It's hard to kind of make it through a month, paycheck to paycheck when you have expenses like that. So we've done a few things to tailor our programs. One example is we have a targeted communities program where Efficiency Vermont staff are on the ground in communities for a year-long engagement, partnering with local groups like town energy committees or municipal leaders, faith leaders, and deciding which projects are going to be most important to the community, and then supporting those projects with additional incentives and technical support. So we have changed the way that we select those communities for participation, and we now focus on energy burdened communities and trying to bring additional resources and expertise to those places that really need it most. We've also used energy burden as a criteria in addition to income and high electricity usage for determining participation in programs that offer free suites of appliances or heating and cooling systems to customers. We had customers saying, you've got this great program, but the qualification requirement is having a high electric bill. I can't afford to have a high electric bill. How can you help me actually manage energy use and get me to a point where I can get past this month-to-month challenge that I have. So using energy burden as a criteria, taking into account that income related to energy usage, helped us to make that shift. And then the last example I'll give is that, I mentioned, this mapping that we did included transportation energy use, and the breakdown is actually very telling. So, in a rural state like Vermont, lots of commuting, lots of driving, long distances, older vehicles in the state. And so we saw that the majority of energy usage was in that transportation category. That was the #1 energy burden for Vermont households, followed by heating, which was the #2, and then electricity was the #3 burden. And so that data helped us go to the legislature and say, you should be, using Efficiency Vermont, this great program that's been in place for 20 years, to tackle the areas of highest burden. And they indeed put us to work, and we have pilots in the transportation sector starting this year for the first time, putting the programs to work to tackle the areas of highest burden. So it took some time to get into the data, to understand really, where people are struggling and what's driving these costs and this burden in communities. And then, once we had that information, we were able to use that in a lot of different ways and put that to work to develop more accessible programs.
I think you, Rebecca, have hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the struggles that we have with efficiency program implementation or climate resiliency work, is that there's the data, which is definitely an important piece, but then it's making sure that it's turning into information, and that our organizations have the capacity to bring in communities and this information and ensure that everyone's part of the decision-making process. So, and that can be really difficult within our historical constructs, like efficiency programs run here or the other programs run here. So Lala, I mean, in our discussions, you've shared quite a bit about CCSR's Equitable Community Engagement Guide. Can you share a little bit more about that for the audience?
Sure, yeah, mahalo. And I just want to lift up that energy burden component. A lot of the work we've been doing, equity spans the breadth and depth, adaptation and mitigation. So dialing in to energy burden, and particularly some of the equitable data specifics, being able to work with Green Links, work with HECO now to share data, and starting to orient ourselves with solutions, investments based on the energy burden, at least for the island of Oahu. So we're being able to start to ramp up that that inclusivity of a broader depth of orientation to where we're going. I also just want to really lift up, if we're talking about community engagement, was the Community-Driven Energy Sovereignty Forum that was organized by Sierra Club with community leaders this past Tuesday and Wednesday. You can check it out on Facebook. Thinking about how these community members could have greater access and representation within the energy sector. How can we further lean into practices, procedural equity out of those 5 dimensions I mentioned early, like lowering the barrier of cost to even participate in forums like this, and access to resources, information, benefits, decision-making, and opportunities within Hawaii energy sector, right? And there's so much opportunity to be able to start getting really innovative and equitable in this space. And I was really glad to see Sunny Unga from Kahuku, as well as the Hoa Energy Cooperative from Molokai, being in these spaces to lead conversations in. And when specifically talking about the engagement guide, right, there's a plethora of tools and frameworks and guides now focused around climate resilience and equity, that there's no longer an excuse not to start really looking at this and demonstrating the possibilities, whether it's private, public, or philanthropic areas. So the guide itself, by law, the Resilience Office is required to coordinate actions and policies of city departments and agencies to advance those 5 dimensions of equity that I mentioned earlier. One of these actions is inclusive community-centered engagement practices and decision-making processes related to increasing community access, participation, and representation in the programs and policies that are being put forth. This commitment to equity is not expressed by our office alone. It's really meant to be throughout the whole city and county. Resolution 20-206 is another example of that in response to COVID. The resolution is looking at citywide general plans and policies that ensure the government attitudes, actions, and services are really sensitive to community needs and concerns. So the guide itself is provides a practical guidance for the Resilience Office and the city to employ more equitable engagement practices for the development of plans, strategies, policies that address immediate concerns of impacted communities. And this guide is a resource to assist in designing community engagement procedures that align with the city's goals, that are meant to be representative of and in service to the socially and culturally diverse communities we have on Oahu. And what we're talking about here, equity can be kind of this big thing. We can't understand how it works. It's great to have it in reports, but how does it look, feel, smell, and be demonstrated in the real world, especially in the next 20 years, even the next 3 to 5 with our recovery? So looking at the work as accountable to impacted communities, and it's going to require intentional investment in relationship building and trust building, and undoing past harm, ideally resulting in broader constituencies of support, and more productive cross-sector working relationships, as I mentioned earlier. And really central to the work is restoring power to these communities over time so they are able to self-determine their futures. This is just going to continue to emerge as we're seeing, especially in the past 5 years in Hawaii, that communities are demanding to be in a much more participatory place within our development, our recovery, and initiatives moving forward. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll just jump in real quick, Lala. That's so great to hear about the Equitable Community Engagement Guide that you all are working with. I can share a few other examples from across the country of how other states and cities are working on equitable community engagement. One model that I think is really important, I think right now, I think only the states of Oregon and California have funds allocated at the state level to support community-based organizations participating in Public Utility Commission proceeding processes. These can be really time-consuming, cumbersome, and without those resources in place, it can be really hard for people to have access to participating. At the city level, there's multiple cities that are making efforts to improve community engagement and share power with community members in the decision-making processes. For example, Seattle and Providence both have environmental justice committees that they've launched in the last few years that are working to empower people from the most impacted communities in those cities to be able to make decisions about what the policy solutions are going to be in the city to address environmental harms. And in particular in Providence, just last year, the city established as well an African-American ambassadors group to develop and advance policies specifically to dismantle oppressive systems and the economic equity gaps for African-Americans in the city. So they're really they're recognizing what the history and the inequities are in the city and working to target that through community engagement processes there.
There's just so much amazing work happening. Before we move into the interactive question and answer, I did just want to talk briefly about some success stories, especially in light of the last year and the pandemic, around efficiency program implementation and evaluation, evaluation is really often the incredibly challenging part of it. But I know from a Hawaii Energy perspective, 2020 was incredibly challenging, but there was also some real success stories that came out of shifts to program design, and we had an incredibly successful grant program that we're going to continue. So Rebecca, I think you have some examples as well of some shifts that have taken place.
Yes, thanks, Karen. Happy to, and just briefly talk through, some of these shifts. I think I'll give one Vermont example and then a Washington, D.C. example as well, since we're implementing programs there. So in Vermont, one of the big focus areas was not only helping reduce this heating energy burden that I talked about last year, but also getting contractors back to work over the course of the summer and fall. And so we really revamped and retooled our existing home energy efficiency program, focusing on providing more and more financial incentive upfront, but also for low and moderate income customers, offering financing and loan payment coverage. So, we did is we, for a limited time, increased our rebates for these kinds of projects up to 75% of project cost. And then we made 0% financing available through local credit unions. And then Efficiency Vermont covered loan payments for the first 6 months. And that really met people where they were, coming out of COVID, like spending all of the time in their homes, not having disposable income, and then staring down, at an upcoming heating season that, was just, we knew was going to be just as bad as any other Vermont winter, but with people having a lot less disposable income to get through that and pay for their oil or deliveries, for example. So through that effort, we saw a 3x increase in projects that completed in August 2020 compared to the previous year. And, 58% of those were low and moderate income households. So, we overall, drove this surge in home retrofits and upgrades, and the majority of those were low and moderate income people taking advantage of this kind of offer. And then it had the secondary impact of really supporting the supply chain and the contractor community at a time when they were still at a low point for their projects. And then the last example I'll give is the DC Sustainable Energy Utility that the EIC operates in their nation's capital. That program has a big focus on solar, and Solar for All is the name of the program. It's focused on reducing the electricity bills for low-income DC residents, both single-family and multifamily residents, by at least 50% over the next 15 years through on household, rooftop solar, and through community solar projects. And so as a result of that work, we measure every year the percentage of customer benefits that go to socially vulnerable communities. DC in 2020 reached 51%. It was our high watermark of over half of the customer incentives and the benefits that we moved as an organization went to socially vulnerable communities, including the wards within DC that are in greatest need. So those are a few examples of how we shifted our work through the pandemic to really respond to where the need was. And like I said, we've seen tremendous results as a consequence of making those changes to meet people where they are and really solve problems for them while we generate clean energy solutions that we need as a planet. So bringing those two things together and rethinking how we approach our programming was really part of 2020's success in terms of driving those kinds of outcomes.
And it was the same for us. I mean, I think Dawn said it earlier that it's once you start moving in the street, it's a one-way street. Like those changes aren't short term. This is going to stay in place. So we've got some great questions in the chat, in the Q&A here. So I'd like to kick it off with, this one was for you, Lala, I think. So have energy burdens been quantified in Hawaii by similar metrics, example, raised housing type income? There's been some work done on that. So.
Yeah, mahalo for that question. And through Green Links, there has. Green Links has an energy burden map called GEM, G-E-M. It is being, it just launched. Over the past year, they've been working. We were part of a cohort with ACEEE, a number of cities that participated in this for the island of Oahu. And we have that energy burden data. And recently we've been working with HECO to get more specific meter data, which is very rare in a city and county to actually get work with utilities to give data to city and county to start measuring and putting it out there. So this is something that I want to lift up as progressive. It's progressive for HECO to do. And doing the energy burden mapping. I think as a city, we're kind of far behind, as mentioned by Rebecca and Ariel. There's energy burden maps all over the country that are being used right now to make decisions. And in Hawaii, the race, housing type, income, location, that is accessible through Green Links. We are adjusting some of the data, so working behind the scenes right now to do some comparison, because there are some differences that we're seeing that we want to really look at, from methodology to specifics, to make sure before we present it out in public that more officially we have had conversations with others. But yes, to your point, it's there and it's coming very soon to be public, actually.
Yeah, and I think that relates to one of the other questions, that is, can Hawaiian Electric Industries be required to report on energy burden rates in the Hawaiian Islands? But, thinking more broadly across the country, Ariel and Rebecca, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how these sort of reporting have been used in policymaking. I know, Rebecca, you already shared some of your experiences, but Ariel, any other, examples to look for?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have seen some cities setting energy burden related goals to achieve. So bringing all households to a 6% level or I think even a 4% level in some places. And also some states also setting goals around energy burden. I haven't seen many utilities yet who have goals in place or regulation at the Public Utility Commission level around energy burden, but I think it's definitely a direction that we could be moving in as public utility commissions think more about how to regulate in an equitable way. I think metrics like energy burden could be something considered. And I think transparency of data reporting can be really important to achieve that accountability that we were talking about earlier as well. Rebecca, anything you'd like to add?
I think just one piece of food for thought, which is some efficiency programs or utilities may have geographic equity components to your performance regulations. In Vermont, our geographic component is weighted toward making sure that our program activity and benefits are meeting the population and like going to county by county in proportion with the population that's in those counties. We've had several conversations with the regulators though about whether it's time to rethink that, and instead of ensuring equitable distribution of funding and benefits back to population centers, whether we should in fact think more about putting the funding to where the greatest burden is as an alternative. So that's an active conversation, and I think that it's something we should all be thinking about as we think about what benefits these programs can provide and how we can put these funds to greatest use.
Well, just as we had anticipated, the time has flown by. I would love to call up the last slide if it's possible, just as a resource. Oh. It looks like we might have an extra minute, so, but at the same time, I would still like to call up this slide as a resource. And maybe just kind of close out, and we can take one more question if we've got time. Just to say on behalf of our panel that if you could take anything away from what we discussed today, is just that this is a call to action and an opportunity to tap into a lot of the work, that foundational work that's already being done, and to use it to overcome challenges, but also drive opportunities at both within the energy efficiency and conservation space, but in all areas of this clean energy work. With a minute or so that we may have, I thought it might be good to kind of synthesize some of the questions. And I think the broader theme I'm seeing is that what else can be included in this type of energy burden analysis, going beyond just perhaps the income, but how are other variables, whether it be locational net benefit, the access to other energy projects within communities, like are there different models for expanding this?
I can speak about that for just a second. So in addition to energy burden, one of the tracking components that BEIC includes organization-wide is, and I mentioned it in passing a minute ago, is tracking where our impacts are being generated based on a community's ranking on something called the Social Vulnerability Index. And that's something that the Centers for Disease Control has set up, and it's based on census data for every census tract in the country. And a community can be ranked as a vulnerable community if a certain 5 out of, I think, 15 or 17 different markers are met. And those include things like income, but it also includes, race, or, different languages spoken, or elderly population, or, mobility challenges. And so there's just a lot of additional dimensions to the Social Vulnerability Index that I think are worth looking at from an energy program perspective. And it's something that we've found very helpful as an organization, because we can look at where all of our impacts are going, not just our low-income residential programs, but also our commercial industrial programs. And if we're helping a small business or a large factory in a socially vulnerable community increase its profitability and maintain jobs, that has a positive impact, as much as helping individual residential households reduce their own energy burden. So the Social Vulnerability Index is something that I'd recommend folks take a look at, because it's a little bit more comprehensive and gives a broader view of the kinds of community impacts that we're all looking to enhance.
Well, thank you. Ariel, any closing thoughts? I know this is big on your research front as well.
I'd just love to.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add really quick. I think something Rebecca just said is really important, that I think often when utilities and many of us think about equity in terms of programs, we think about low income programs, but we really should be thinking about equity across everything that's being offered by a utility. Who's having access to all different types of programs? And I think when we think more broadly like that, we can also, there's so many other factors that we can be looking at, right? Along with energy burden, wealth building in communities, who has access to clean energy jobs, et cetera. So I think the metrics can really be much more expansive, and I'm hoping that we'll continue to move in that direction.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here again today and for the extra couple minutes we were able to get, because this is such an important topic. And I hope we can do this all again soon. So thank you. And thank you to the Hawaii Energy Conference once again.